Nearly 1 million soldiers fought inside a single ruined city. Hundreds of thousands never left it. Buildings changed hands 10 times in a single day. Men froze to death in the snow, still holding their weapons. And by the time it was finally over, the army that Adolf Hitler believed was unstoppable had been completely destroyed. This is the story of Stalingrad. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II history, please follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these stories, and we'd love to have you as part of this journey. Now, let's step back into the summer of 1942, into the heart of the Soviet Union. By mid-1942, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, had already lasted a year, and while German forces had captured enormous territory, they had failed to deliver the quick, decisive victory Hitler had originally promised his generals. Hitler now set his sights on a city along the Volga River called Stalingrad. It carried enormous symbolic weight, named directly after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin himself. Capturing it would represent a devastating psychological blow to Soviet morale, beyond even its practical strategic value. Stalingrad was also genuinely important militarily. Sitting along the Volga River, one of the Soviet Union's most vital transportation routes for oil, grain, and military supplies, flowing between southern regions and the rest of the country. In August 1942, German forces launched a massive assault on the city, beginning with devastating aerial bombing raids that reduced much of Stalingrad to rubble within just a few days, killing thousands of civilians who had not yet managed to evacuate. Joseph Stalin, however, refused to allow Soviet civilians to evacuate the city in large numbers, believing their continued presence would motivate his soldiers to fight harder to defend their homes rather than abandoning the city entirely to German forces. As German infantry pushed into the city itself, they encountered something entirely different from the open, sweeping battles they had fought across the Russian steppes earlier in the campaign. Stalingrad's destroyed streets and collapsed buildings created a nightmarish new kind of warfare. Soviet soldiers and civilians alike began fighting from inside destroyed buildings, basements, sewers, and bombed-out factories, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat that German soldiers began grimly calling Rattenkrieg, or the War of the Rats. Entire buildings changed hands multiple times within a single day, with Soviet and German soldiers sometimes occupying different floors of the exact same structure simultaneously, fighting fierce battles up staircases and through hallways for control of a single room. One particular building, a 4-story apartment structure that came to be known as Pavlov's house, became legendary during the battle. A small group of Soviet soldiers held this single building against repeated German attacks for nearly 2 entire months. The fighting for the Mamayev Kurgan, a large hill overlooking the city, proved equally brutal, changing hands repeatedly between Soviet and German forces, with the hill's soil reportedly turning permanently black and red from the sheer volume of ash and blood soaked into the ground. Soviet snipers played an unusually significant role throughout the battle, picking off German officers and soldiers from concealed positions within the rubble. One sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, became particularly famous, reportedly killing over 200 German soldiers during the fighting. As autumn turned into winter, conditions inside the city grew even more horrific. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, and soldiers on both sides struggled desperately with frostbite, starvation, and complete physical exhaustion, even as the brutal urban fighting continued without pause. German soldiers, many still equipped with summer uniforms, never intended for the brutal Russian winter, suffered enormously from the extreme cold, while supply lines stretched dangerously thin across hundreds of miles of hostile, increasingly hostile territory. Meanwhile, Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov had been secretly planning something far more ambitious than simply defending the city street by street, a massive counterattack designed to completely encircle and trap the entire German force fighting inside Stalingrad. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive coordinated offensive striking German flanks positioned north and south of the city, flanks that were defended primarily by weaker Romanian and Italian Allied troops rather than German soldiers themselves. These flanking forces, poorly equipped and significantly outnumbered, collapsed rapidly under the weight of the Soviet assault. Within just 4 days, Soviet forces from the north and south had successfully linked up, completely encircling the entire German Sixth Army trapped inside Stalingrad. Approximately 250,000 German and Allied soldiers now found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and any realistic possibility of retreat, trapped inside the very ruins they had spent months fighting to capture. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, promised Hitler that his planes could adequately supply the trapped army entirely by air, keeping them fed and equipped until reinforcements could eventually break through the Soviet encirclement to rescue them. This promise proved catastrophically unrealistic. German aircraft, hampered by brutal winter weather and increasingly effective Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, managed to deliver only a small fraction of the food, ammunition, and medical supplies the trapped army desperately needed to survive. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted to organize a rescue operation, launching a relief force specifically designed to break through Soviet lines and reach the trapped Sixth Army. But this desperate rescue attempt ultimately fell short, stopped by determined Soviet resistance, roughly 40 miles from the city. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated into something approaching absolute horror. Soldiers, receiving barely a fraction of necessary rations, began dying from starvation and extreme cold at an alarming rate, even before Soviet attacks claimed additional lives daily. German General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the trapped Sixth Army, repeatedly requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout or negotiate surrender, recognizing that his army's situation had become genuinely hopeless beyond any realistic possibility of rescue or survival. Hitler, however, absolutely refused to authorize either option, insisting that Paulus and his men hold their positions at all costs, viewing any retreat or surrender as an unacceptable admission of German weakness that would damage national morale and prestige. In a final, almost theatrical gesture, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal in late January 1943, reportedly hoping this honor would inspire him to fight to the death rather than surrender, since no German field marshal had ever previously surrendered in the field. Despite this symbolic pressure, Paulus recognized that further resistance served no meaningful military purpose whatsoever, and on January 31, 1943, he formally surrendered himself and the southern portion of his remaining forces to Soviet troops. The remaining northern pocket of German resistance surrendered just 2 days later, on February 2, 1943, officially marking the complete and total end of one of the largest, most devastating battles in the entire history of human warfare. The human cost of the battle proved almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that combined military and civilian casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing across both sides, likely exceeded 1.5 million people during the roughly 5 months of continuous fighting. Of the roughly 91,000 German and Allied soldiers taken prisoner during the surrender, only a small fraction, likely fewer than 6,000, would ever survive the brutal conditions of Soviet prisoner of war camps and eventually return home to Germany after the war. For Nazi Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad represented an absolutely devastating strategic and psychological blow. The Sixth Army, one of Germany's most powerful and experienced military formations, had been completely destroyed, its soldiers either dead or captured entirely. Perhaps even more significantly, Stalingrad shattered the myth of German military invincibility that had dominated the early years of the war, proving definitively to the world that Hitler's seemingly unstoppable war machine could, in fact, be decisively defeated and destroyed. From this point forward, German forces would remain almost entirely on the defensive across the Eastern Front, gradually forced backward through Ukraine, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself, as Soviet forces steadily pushed westward toward Berlin over the following 2 years. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad became an enduring symbol of national resilience and sacrifice, commemorated for decades afterward as one of the most significant turning points not just in the war, but in the entire history of the Soviet nation itself. Today, the city, now renamed Volgograd, still honors this brutal history through massive memorials, including the towering statue known as the Motherland Calls, standing on Mamayev Kurgan, the very hill where so much of the fiercest fighting once took place. Thanks so much for watching. If this brutal, world-changing story surprised you, please leave a comment below, follow our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more untold stories from World War II. Until next time, take care.